Hello, and welcome back to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and this is my very first non-Chad Daybell related video. Today we're going to talk about adverbs and why books on writing say not to use them. Now, if you clicked on this video for the Daybell stuff, I completely understand if you click off. Life is too short to watch videos on topics that don't interest us, and I promise I have plenty more Daybell lit crit coming down the pipeline. The Chad Daybell Doomsday Universe rabbit hole just keeps getting deeper. But in this video, I want to talk about adverbs and one of the most common pieces of writing advice I see, which is to avoid them. Let's begin with definitions and then move the heck on out of there because definitions are boring. I'm not a huge fan of getting bogged down with grammatical definitions and rules, so I try to use parts of speech pretty sparingly. Adverbs are, simply put, words that characterize other words. Most, but certainly not all, adverbs end in ly, and most, but certainly not all, adverbs characterize verbs, action words. For example, the puppy howled angrily. Angrily is our adverb here. I've put it in blue. It characterizes the action word howled. Usually if an adverb is applied to a verb, an action word, it's going to tell us how something is done, but sometimes it also tells us when. Here are some more examples. I spit furiously at Chad Daybell. She signed the bill quickly. Frank quietly told Marnie to call the police. Unfortunately, Melanie's Reddit post had already blown up. You get the idea. There are a lot more adverbs that don't end in ly, words like very, really, well, often, soon, always, sometimes, to, here, now. There's like a million others. But I'm going to ignore the ones that don't end in ly because when I'm reading books on writing advice, it's pretty much always the ly verbs the author is talking about. I don't know if a lot of people assume that ly adverbs are the only adverbs, or if they have a particular problem with them, but I've never read a book on writing that advised against using now or often. The advice I have read is nearly always the same. Stop using adverbs. Even Stephen King says not to use them, and he uses them all the time. So I think the best way to talk about adverbs is to look at the major objections to them, and by paring away the bad uses, we'll understand better how to use them well. The first complaint I've heard is that if a verb requires an adverb, you're using the wrong verb. For example, people will say that if you write said quietly, you should just change it to whispered. I just don't agree with this at all. First off, this assumes that the English language contains every word you could ever need. Look at the first example I gave. Well, the second, actually. I spit furiously at Chad Daybell. Is there a different verb that could replace spit that would eliminate the need for the word furiously? Not that I can think of. English lacks a designated word to describe a frantic, angry spitting motion. Second, this advice seems to originate in the idea that all writing should be tight and muscular. But it shouldn't. That's not everybody's style. Some writers value precision more than brevity, and adverbs allow us to weaken or strengthen verbs by degree. For example, let's say you have a character who's going to walk across a bridge over a lava pit. Lucy walked across the bridge over the lava pit. And you want to include an adverb to tell us how she walked across this bridge. If she's being chased by a bear, you might want her to walk quickly across the bridge. Is that the same as running across the bridge? I don't think so. I don't know how wide the bridge is, but what if it's only 6 inches? Is she really going to run across it? Or is she going to walk, but quickly, because she knows there's a bear following her? Lucy walked quickly across the bridge over the lava pit. Lucy walked carefully across the bridge over the lava pit. Still on her phone, Lucy walked obliviously across the bridge over the lava pit. These are all very different depictions. On the other hand, sometimes there are delightful verbs that can replace a weaker verb-adverb pairing. Suddenly, someone knocked loudly on the door can be changed to suddenly, someone beat on the door. Suddenly, someone pounded on the door. Suddenly, someone cop-knocked on the door. Long story short, I once heard a guy accuse another guy of cop-knocking on his door. I don't think that's a real verb, but the fun of being a writer is making things up. Note, however, that removing suddenly at the beginning of the sentence would make the sentence weaker. Someone beat on the door. It doesn't quite catch you off guard in the same way, does it? Others complain that some adverbs are only used for emphasis and aren't technically necessary. For example, I found this sentence in Chad Daybell's novel, The Keys of the Kingdom, on page 103. Elias fully understood who he was dealing with. Is fully necessary here? It depends. Elias understood who he was dealing with has a very different feel to it. Personally, in this case, I'd side with Chad, but only because the person with whom Elias is dealing happens to be Satan, and I can see why Chad would want to emphasize that Elias fully understands with whom he's dealing. However, in the following sentence, which is also from The Keys of the Kingdom, but I forgot to write down the page number, so you can find it if you're really desperate. Everyone was just happy to actually have food and water again, and things were definitely looking up. Both adverbs could probably be removed here, and the sentence would benefit. Everyone was just happy to have food and water again, and things were looking up. It's interesting that removing the adverb definitely reveals how weak the second half of this sentence is. Chad was using definitely to beef up his cliché. If you find yourself doing this, remember that the cliché is the problem, not the adverb. Another complaint I see about adverbs is that people will use them in place of details. This is a legit complaint, but it's not the adverb's fault. I talked to my partner, Gosha, about this idea, and he pointed out that this is fundamentally a showing versus telling issue. We came up with the following example. As Sharon finished putting the groceries in her trunk, a man wearing mirrored sunglasses approached her. She turned to retrieve her purse from her cart and only then realized how close the man was standing. She could smell the cigarettes on his breath. He lifted the hem of his ragged t-shirt and flashed the pistol tucked in his waistband. "Get in the trunk," the man said menacingly. What happens if we remove the word menacingly? He lifted the hem of his ragged t-shirt and flashed the pistol tucked in his waistband. "Get in the trunk," the man said in a low and level tone. Gosha pointed out that you have to trust that your reader will understand the subtext without you spelling it out for them. He said, you have to trust in the competence of your reader. And the reason this is desirable, the reason we want to show instead of tell, is that showing works on the unconscious. Telling works on the conscious level. It works on our thoughts. But the unconscious level is where our emotions come from. And if we can affect a reader's unconscious, we can make them feel things, which is awesome. In the example I just shared, the word menacingly spoon-feeds the reader. But if we only give them details, that this is a guy in mirrored sunglasses, a ragged t-shirt, carrying a weapon, who smells of cigarettes and speaks in a controlled manner, then our unconscious is doing what it does best. It's putting all those details together to let us know he's a bad dude. Instead of learning that the guy is menacing, the reader feels uneasy about him, and they aren't sure why. Much more desirable, in my opinion. As Gosha put it, adverbs should guide the reader towards specificity. They should not overwrite the reader's interpretive ability. And yes, he's brilliant. I also think that writers can sometimes use adverbs as a way to justify repetition. I was in grad school when Twilight came out, and since I was in the program for writing for children and young adults, of course we were all talking about it. A classmate of mine told me that the thing she hated most about that book was that Edward was constantly chuckling, and the chuckle was always followed by an adverb. It was lots of Edward chuckled wryly and Edward chuckled softly. It drove her nuts. Incidentally, wryly is Gosha's most hated adverb. He particularly dislikes when a character says something wryly, because the dialogue should speak for itself in that case. He's not wrong. Because I talked extensively about point of view in my last video, I want to mention that adverbs can be used to subtly reinforce point of view by characterizing actions. "I didn't care if he made it home or not," Amanda said honestly. Ron opened his textbook apprehensively. These two sentences use adverbs to reinforce point of view by characterizing actions in a way that describes the character's inner experience. The reason I say reinforce rather than identify is because this is a subtle use of adverbs that's open to interpretation. We can argue about whether or not a person could observe that Amanda was being honest. Apprehensively is a bit more clear-cut. We can't really know that another person is experiencing apprehension. But if the sentence were, Ron opened his test booklet nervously, I think we would all agree that nervousness is often observable. Personally, my major complaint with adverbs is just redundancy. I think the all-time worst use of an adverb is the phrase whispered softly. There's no reason to include softly here. Softness is the defining quality of whispering. We don't need to be reminded that it's soft. The same goes for shouting loudly and running quickly. However, I still think adverbs have value and should be used when appropriate. How do we know when they're appropriate? The most important question for me is, do they add information? "I forgot my gum," Dion whispered frantically. Here, we wouldn't expect Dion to be upset about forgetting gum, so frantically adds information. Whereas, "I forgot my rescue inhaler," Dion whispered, doesn't require the use of frantically. We as readers already feel alarm based on the content of the sentence. Regarding the gum sentence, it might be possible to replace the adverb with a description. We can try it out. "I forgot my gum," Dion whispered, his words running together. This is a very literal replacement. It's literally attempting to replace frantically with a description of what frantically means when applied to this action. Is it better? I don't think so. We'll try it again. "I forgot my gum," Dion whispered, speaking quickly and in a frantic tone. This one is even worse. It's too long. This is probably another topic for a different video, but controlling how long your reader spends reading is a great way to emphasize what's important and what isn't. Here, the description of the way Dion speaks is so long that it distracts from the content of his statement, which is the important part. "I forgot my gum," Dion whispered, grabbing my arm. This one isn't too bad. If the story were told in third person, though, we might pick something that speaks to Dion's inner experience. "I forgot my gum," Dion whispered to himself, his pulse speeding up. Personally, I like the version where Dion grabs the narrator's arm. It adds a little bit of conflict. But if the story were in third person, I might just stick with frantically, especially if I were trying to keep the scene moving as quickly as possible. I decided I should end this video with an example of good adverb use, so I went to my reading nook and grabbed the first fiction book that caught my eye, which just so happened to be Herman Wouk's The Winds of War, which is my father's favorite book. And I kid you not, I opened it at random, and this is the opening of the first paragraph I read. "Winston Churchill, today an idealized hero of history, was in his time variously considered a bombastic blunderer, an unstable politician, an intermittently inspired orator, a reckless self-dramatizer, a voluminous able writer in an old-fashioned vein, and a warmongering drunkard. Through most of his long life, he cut an antic, brilliant, occasionally absurd figure in British affairs." Colorful, right? Wouk was a delightful, very smart writer, and if you happen to enjoy well-researched World War II fiction with excellent characterizations, The Winds of War should go on your reading list. But it was near the end of the paragraph when I found the best example, and I'm very sad that this is YouTube and I'm going to have to leave out the rest of the paragraph, which discusses Wee Moustache and his friends. But listen to this part. "By keeping back the 25 squadrons from the lost Battle of France, he acted toughly, wisely, and ungallantly, and he turned the war to the course that ended 5 long years later." Toughly, wisely, and ungallantly is amazing. My mind was blown by this contradictory characterization. I haven't read this book since college, but it might make a nice palate cleanser after I finish with the CDDU. If that ever happens. Anyway, I love the way this hits. It's compliment, compliment, criticism. Ungallantly draws so much attention to itself that it feels almost like a stamp of judgment laid down on Churchill's picture. I tried to rewrite it, avoiding using adverbs. "Keeping back the 25 squadrons from the lost Battle of France was tough, wise, and ungallant." It's okay. I don't like it nearly as well as the original. I think the repetition of the ly words in the original works in its favor. It demarcates those 3 words as belonging together. Plus, ungallant is already an awkward word. Adding yet another syllable to the end makes it so unwieldy that it contrasts with toughly and wisely, just in a purely audio sense. Basically, Wook used the adverb forms of these words to show us that the three descriptors belong together, but also that one of these things is not like the others. That is so nuanced and layered, and it reflects Churchill's contradictory personality, dare I say, beautifully. So go forth and write adverbs. Do it consciously and conscientiously, but don't fear the adverb. Just remember to use your words wisely. See you next time.